Let me know when you've got it started and then we can.
Yep, I just hit the record button.
Okay, cool. All right, well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming and thanks for networking to start. This is a good start to it. I kind of wanted to make this a little bit of an interactive presentation. So the first thing I'm gonna do is ask everybody, so you have two options. One is you can scan the QR code that's here on the left, or you can go to menti.com, that's M-E-N-T-I, and use the code that's written here to kind of take a little survey. There's a couple of these throughout the presentation. I thought it'd be a little fun way. I was really hoping this would work and work within the slide here itself, and it's not, so I'm gonna like back out in for a second. But so I just kind of know about who's here in the audience. You can either give anything about yourself personally, professionally, like where you're from. It's gonna build a little word cloud, and let me like back out of this. And then so as you're doing it, let's see if this is going. We'll get some live results of who's here. All right, cool. I'll give another like 10, 15 seconds. If anybody's having trouble, it's not the end of the world. Feel free to put some stuff in the chat if you'd like. But it's looking like, you know, we've got a lot of people here are Scrum Masters, and obviously we've got a lot of change managers and change management. I think, you know, Craig's coworker, awesome. I think it's really interesting. Like, obviously we're expecting a lot of change people, but Scrum Masters are also, I kind of feel like change agents as well. We've got Agile coaches, people from Arlington, Lego builders, technologists. Cool. All right. That was a fun little exercise to see who's here. Let me get back into the presentation, and we will get right back to it. All right. Awesome. So I'll go into a little bit. Here's the agenda for this presentation. So first, I'll give a little bit of a personal introduction. I'll talk a little bit about like what is defect management, so you even know why you're here in the first place and have a little bit more context into this whole presentation. I think it'll probably be new to you. It was new to me for the most part before I really got into it, trial by fire this year. Then I'll give a little bit about the project background, about like how we even got into the situation in the first place. And then I'll get into more about my experiences and lessons learned, which I think will really hit on like the change management aspect of this presentation. So then there'll be some time at the end for questions and discussions. And then I've also got a short survey at the end that's private, so we can get some feedback on this session. So it should take about 45 minutes in my little practice sessions. And I'll try and keep us on that schedule so everybody can, you know, get on with their evenings. But if you have any questions, as Miranda said, you can put them in the chat. I may or may not see them, so Miranda, feel free to like kind of just like butt in and do it. I've got my like sticky notes here. I'd be a terrible Scrum Master if I didn't. So if we can't get to them, then we can just put them in the parking lot for later. All right, here's me. It's got my email address and my LinkedIn profile on there as well. And I will be posting this presentation on my LinkedIn. So if you want to view it as a PDF, you are welcome to do that. I'm a Scrum Master at Excella. I've been here since the January of 2019. You know, I've given another presentation here for those who have come to several change management meetups. I've been in 2019 on Lean Canvases, if you remember. I've been doing IT project management and Agile type work for over 10 years, mostly as a Scrum Master. I mostly have done Agile transformation, going from like waterfall to Agile, and software as a service projects in both the federal and commercial sector. And just a little bit about me, over quarantine, I got a little bit addicted to true crime podcasts. So if there's any crime junkies out there, like you can say hi. I don't know if this is really embarrassing or not. There's a little something about me. So if you have any recommendations on podcasts, like so I can go on my walks during the day, I would love it. So I'll just keep on with this. All right. my next poll of the evening. So I'm going to ask you all to also scan the QR code on your phone, and I'll kind of do that as well. I just kind of want to get a sense of what your level of knowledge is about defect management before we start. So there's three options. So one is, first I've ever heard of it. Two, I've done a little bit, or three, as in the, oh, this is working in the thing. That's awesome. All right, cool. This is what I intended it to do. I guess the word cloud was not working. So let's just, there better be a few expert mode people in here, because I know there's a few of you from my project that, that know quite a bit about this. So let's see where we've got. All right. One person is first time they've ever heard of it. So good, you'll get to learn a little something new and take something out of it. And looks like some people have done a little bit, but haven't really delved in quite deeply. So this is good. All right. So let's talk about what defect management is. Like, let's talk about like the 101s of it. And it's just really simply is the process we put in place to identify and fix defects or bugs in the system. So defects can happen at any point in the life cycle, and the goal is to catch them early on. And I'll talk about why that's important a little bit later on in the next slide. And I think it's really like important note here. Defect management has six, and I'd say like a seventh step to it. And so the first step is the discovery phase. And so this is where you discover as many defects as possible. And ideally you're doing this in like unit testing, smoke testing, regression testing, before your end customer even sees the product, right? Discovery can also be a user calling your help desk to let them know that you have a problem. And that's usually how we find a lot of the bugs that you find in your system. So once it's discovered, you need to either accept it or reject it as a defect. So I can't tell you how many times we've tried just, closing your browser, refreshing the page, trying again, and it's fine, and we just move on with our lives. And that's an example of like rejecting the bug. It's just like a weird one-off instance, and maybe it's not really worth looking into. The second step is categorization. So it's how you prioritize your bugs. And usually it's something like critical, high, medium, low. And this is probably one of the most crucial things because it aids in your planning on how you're going to resolve them. And the next step obviously is your resolution. So this is the process by which like a developer or a team member fixes the problem that's come up. Usually they're assigned to it, time is allocated to fix it, the defect is fixed, and then a resolution is reported to like a testing team. So step 4 is for the testing team to validate it and verify that it's actually been resolved. Step 5 is your closeout. And so that's once it's been verified, then you can close out the bug. The last step is reporting. And so this is when you would be like giving defect reports, and feedback should be sent to better track and explain the defects in more detail. So this can help determine like root causes so that these kind of things don't happen in the future. This is where you might gain some metrics and report out on to this to other people. And the 7th is something that I've kind of added in here myself. You usually will see it more with like these 6 steps, but I think it's really important as like, it's sort of like a cyclical nature, is that, you should always be inspecting and adapting your process. So these first 6 steps could take somewhere between 1 day to like a year, depending on when you can actually resolve a bug. And there's really no way of knowing. So you should always be looking at your process and refining it to make it better. So this was a really interesting thing that I found, like kind of researching some of the stuff for this presentation. So there was a study done by the System Sciences Institute, it's hard to say that fast, at IBM, and they have reported that the cost to fix an error after product release was 4 to 5 times as much as one uncovered during design, and up to 100 more times one that identified in the maintenance phase. So, I mean, if you see this chart, just like the exponential growth it is at the later it goes on. And I think a lot of people might be more familiar with this, and like there's a table the same way about changing requirements and how much less expensive it is to change a requirement at the beginning of a project versus how expensive it can be later on. I found this really interesting because if you're not properly identifying and managing your defects before you go live, the potential cost is just so extremely exponential. Like I didn't really think that it was this bad until I've actually experienced it. And that's kind of what kind of led to this presentation. Prevention becomes that much more valuable. But we're never going to be perfect. And so there's always going to be defects, and we need to become better at managing them. And so the longer defects remain active, the more that they will cost you. So this kind of brings a really important point, is that it's important to have processes and procedures in place that can sustain your defect management system you use. If it's not sustainable, it really just won't work. And what bad defect management can actually do is result in downtime, loss of revenue. Your customers may decide they're never coming back to your site. They may never come back to your store. It really depends on what you're building and putting out there. You might lose customers forever. You might just get a bad reputation, and that's not something you want to have either. You don't want to have like the buggy system, and your company is the one that builds buggy software for it. So you could lose follow-on work or miss additional deadlines that come with it as well. On the other hand, you can really overdo your defect management. So perfection is the enemy of progress. You can delay releases. You can have disappointment in your staff and really low morale by not releasing and not putting your products out there. So if you're working in an agile environment, and I think a lot of us are here, and even if you're not, it's also really important to value like working software and the ability to respond to change. So you really just need to get it right. And this is kind of like the Goldilocks, scenarios. You just want to do not too much, not too little, just get it just right. All right, so a little bit about the project background here, and I'm taking out a lot of like identifiable information, to protect the innocent, because it's still going on right now. We are in the middle of it. It's a federal SAFE project, and that's a scaled agile framework with 11 delivery teams. I hope I counted that number right. And we have like 9 technical support teams and business teams. So if you think about that in terms of like just the total number of people, it's about 150 to 200 like individuals who are, touching our application that we're building in one way or another. And that's like humongous. At least for me, it's huge. I'm used to working on like much smaller scale projects. It was a large scale multi-year project with a hard release date due to the sunset of legacy systems. So we were releasing October 2020 because we had 2 systems that were going offline, and we had to replace them. There was no option. So in addition, we also did integrate with multiple external applications. So we had to have 2-way communication between them. So when I talk about massive amount of work, it really was, and it was really risky to release it. We really worked with an MVP focus, and I think this is really important because we weren't trying to overdo it. We were really just trying to get the just right. What's a minimum amount you can put out to your customers? MVP stands for minimum viable product. So this is one of the first times I've really worked on a project with an MVP focus. We were really cutting stuff out left and right. I mean, if it really wasn't necessary or you couldn't do a workaround, no matter how tedious and time consuming it would be, we cut it out. I think there's a lot of people here who can attest to that. And it's just kind of really goes to show how much work really went into it to even get it out the door. And then we also did a big bang release for it. We did a very, very limited pre-release, but for the most part, we really flipped a switch over a weekend and the new application was live. All right, so let's talk about our list of red flags. So obviously hindsight is 2020, and we could have seen a lot of these things coming. I think a lot of us did see these things coming, but we didn't realize to the magnitude that it would be. We could scrutinize every single decision along the way, but I kind of wanted to bring up the ones that I think are most relevant and that you might see coming on a project that you're working on. The biggest one for us is just the sheer amount of work that we had. We had hundreds of features that we assigned to the teams in like little pieces of chunks of work. And we wanted everything to sort of fit within the bounds of our 1-2 week sprint. And so like things didn't always kind of line up perfectly, and we had to like stop our development at maybe like unnatural points. And then we did something called stubbing data. And so we had to like, put little placeholders in there for us to come back and reconnect at a later point. And so when you're doing this, like end-to-end testing really wasn't an option at the time of our development work. It ultimately left us with a lot of holes and confusion about who would ultimately be responsible for making sure that it all worked from start to finish. A second one, and you can probably all like, attest to this or have heard this before, is we continue our development work up until about 2 weeks prior to the release of the application. We had originally planned for about like a 3-month code cutoff point, where we would do a code hardening and really test it hard, and we just couldn't get everything done in time due to our MVP commitments, so we had to keep going. Our third was that we did not have very good test data available in our testing environments. And, I think a lot of people are very used to this. You have personally identifiable PII, personally identifiable information. I think that's what it stands for. But so you really couldn't get a sense of like a true sense of whether something was working or not, because we used a bunch of like random data and random like names and things in there. Our fourth was that defect management was not sufficiently addressed because a lot of our resources were needed to get things out the door and focused on the release. I mean, there was some planning for it, but I don't think anybody thought it would ever get to the point where we were at. So I didn't think people thought it was as necessary. Let's see, I see something in the chat. Lastly, we did not have enough planning around assessing risk. And I think a lot of change management people in here will really resonate with this one, is that we didn't really plan for the worst case scenario. I think we planned for like a very mild scenario, and I wasn't necessarily involved in that planning, but I think we all knew there would be some defects, but not to the level that we had. All right, so a little bit about expectations versus reality. So on the left is what we actually expected and planned for our team. So we had 11 teams who were planning to do about 80% of their work for enhancements and moving on with the stuff that wasn't part of our MVP, and to spend about 20% of their time on bugs. And we were going to do this for about like a sprint or two, and everything was going to kind of go back to normal. And the teams would generally be responsible for fixing the stuff that they built. Maybe you'd go outside of your comfort zone or whatever, but you'd pretty much know where to put things. However, we released and things like quickly got out of hand. So we had teams doing about more like a 90-10 split, like we have on the right. And I think a lot of our teams, our delivery teams, went all the way up to like 100%. And we probably even surpassed that capacity because people were working overtime just to try and get it right and get it moving. If we circle back to like the cost of fixing items that I talked about previously, I mean, you see how expensive this is versus this. I mean, you're still spending the cost on resources, but your cost is going towards fixing things that you already had versus adding actual new value for your customers. All right, so a nice little quote. I don't know how many people have heard this before, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So as I mentioned earlier, you can never really prevent defects from happening, right? There's going to be something. We're not perfect people. But if we were able to take some maybe more measured steps along the way and maybe cut our defects down like 25%, we'd be in a huge difference today from where we are. We'd be in a much more manageable position. So obviously for us and our project, things did not quite go as well as we would have liked, or else, we probably wouldn't be here talking about this to this level. But, once we were able to get a handle on some of the overwhelming number of defects, we were able to really inspect, adapt, and refine our processes. And so I'm going to talk about some of the steps we took, what I wish we would have done differently, and what lessons I learned from it that I think will be very helpful for you and for your team. All right. So here's where I'm going to talk about my experiences and learn. So this presentation really focuses on 5 different areas that we made big changes in. And I think this is where we really get into the change management aspect of this, because I'm hoping that my experiences will help you adopt change and drive success at an individual level and at an organizational level for your projects. So for each one, I'm going to give each a problem, a solution, and our hypothesis for what we were testing against. And so these weren't the only things that we did on the project, but these were the ones I wanted to talk about because they're relevant to just about everybody. So I'll give a little bit about each one, and then I'm going to have us do a little vote afterwards. So the first one here is setting a prioritization policy. This is where you would have predefined criteria for your prioritizing your defects. Our second was establishing a tiger team. So this is when we got a group of subject matter experts together on one team to solve. Third is adopting Scrumban, and this might be a new term for a lot of people in here. I think it was for me a little bit. This is where we combine Scrum and Kanban to manage the team process. Fourth is we created defect standards for readiness. We set minimum requirements for getting defects ready to work on. The fifth one is creating a bug service level agreement. So this is where we set expected time for completing development and testing on. And then just for fun, I rated each one on the extermination scale of like how many bug sprays out of 10 would I recommend that you use these for. And before we get started on talking about each one, I have another poll for you all. So if you want to take it and scan the code on the left, or you can use the Menti thing here. I just want to kind of see what you think will be the highest rated item. Let's see if we have any good predictions before we start. Let's see if this updates as well while this type of things works. Oh, good, it's working. All right. All right. All right, so we think setting a prioritization policy for 4 people. We've got adopting Scrumban and creating defect standards as our second tied. Creating a bug service level agreement is the last, and establishing a tiger team got 0 votes. So, all right, let's go find out what is our winner. All right, a prioritization policy. So as bugs begin to, our problem, we thought as bugs begin to materialize, we need a quick way to determine what we should prioritize. So our solution for this is to set priority levels for the defects based on predefined criteria. And the hypothesis was by setting urgency level on the predefined criteria, it'll be easier to prioritize which ones we need to complete first. It's maybe one of the most straightforward ones in it. And this falls into the categorization step of the process. And I kind of just want to highlight that, and I will highlight the step of the process as we go through, just so you see where things kind of lie in the process. All right, so this is one of the things that we actually did plan for, and we actually did a pretty decent job at it. And before we went live to production, there was a prioritization policy established for addressing newly found defects. So the key advantage to doing something like this is that it's a really lightweight approach to managing defects. You would really reduce the amount of time spent debating what should be done with each defect. So prioritizing bugs by policy does require some initial effort to create the policies and come to an agreement beforehand. But once you're done and once it's created, you actually have something that you can use to prioritize bugs, and then all your prioritization exercises really become more trivial after that. You're not spending a lot of time like debating whether something's the highest priority or the second highest priority. You kind of already know. The goal with an approach like this is prioritizing defects is mostly to become something more objective rather than subjective. And yes, there's always going to be room for debate. There's always going to be somebody who is like really pushing for one priority level versus another, but really beyond that, prioritizing defects becomes no more time consuming than consulting your policy. And when you're looking at priority, there's really 2 main categories that comprise of priority. Really, the first is severity, and that's how bad is your problem, and if there is like a workaround available. The second would be likelihood, and that's how often is the defect occurring. So is it happening to all of your users? Is it happening to just one user, but one really important user? Or is it something that maybe it's just a really small subset of people are experiencing? So once you define your criteria, you can create a matrix. And this is not our matrix. I don't think I even have privy to the matrix that we have, but we have a general definition of each one in here. So on the left-hand side, you have your severity, and these you have things like minor, they're cosmetic, they're easy workarounds, like a moderate with a small workaround. It's going all the way up to urgent, where it has a high impact and users cannot do their job. It puts your organization at risk, things like that. And then the likelihood, we just would base it on the number of users. And you could probably do this as like a percentage of people. I mean, I just have small, medium, high, and all. I mean, that's kind of subjective to your your project and your assignment and your application, what you would consider your thresholds in there. And some kind of like items to note on here is really like I kind of wanted to highlight is something like that's like cosmetic. We have in this is like no more than like a 3, right? So I know if you probably work with like UX or UI people, they're going to say otherwise, and it should be a 1. But you know, you have to draw the line in the sand somewhere. And so when you have like bigger fish to fry, like you can't do your job, you don't really have to go fix your little cosmetic changes quite so, you know, over the ones that are really urgent. And then the bottom column here is that if the organization is at risk or someone's going to audit, like it automatically becomes the highest priority. There's no even debate about it, no ifs, ands, or buts. All right, so obviously this sounds like super easy and like nothing could ever go wrong with it. But but what ends up happening is that if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And this is like a really like quote I'm sure a lot of people have heard before. And I really like this comic that kind of goes with it. It has the guy saying our short-term priorities to stay focused on our long-term priorities, and our long-term priorities to foster total commitment to our short-term priorities. It just kind of goes to saying that like, you know, you need to make sure that your priorities really have value or meaning towards them, or else you're just doing it for show. So what happened for us is that too many defects started coming in, and they were coming in from all kinds of people and all kinds of sources into our ticketing system. And then we started seeing something that we call like priority inflation. And so, you know, we had so many bugs that we were only guaranteed to get attention were the ones with like the highest priority items. So of course, people realize this, right? So like, you know, if you don't give the bug a highest priority, people were like setting it themselves in our ticketing system. And if you don't give it a 1 or a 2, then no one's even going to look at it. It's just going to sit in the backlog, and this is never going to get done. And you know, it's important to you, but it might not be important to the overall bigger picture. So it's kind of really created a big problem for us. So stakeholders would embellish the severity of their issues, and it caused the priority to inflate. And this meant that less critical items would jump the line, and causing the truly essential items to get skipped or even like missed altogether. So we thought that setting the initial matrix would be sufficient, and obviously it wasn't. And our backlog became too overwhelming with this priority inflation. So like, what do you do to combat this issue? You kind of have to prioritize your already prioritized items. And so this is one of these things I really wish that we would have done sooner and really like talked about more like from our project, and something that I've done previously somewhere else. We were running out of time to get all of our features done. And so we had to prioritize the remaining features that we had. And it's something that's called the $100 game. I think I've seen it to the 100 cents game, but you know, whatever you want to call it, you know, you give everybody a list of options, and then you give each participant $100 to spend. So they can spend as much as they want on any one particular item. They can spend $100 on one, they can spend $20 on 5, $10 on 10, or, you know, and so on. So this is usually done in secret. You can do it using like an Excel spreadsheet or a Google survey or something like that. And really the point is you don't want other people to influence the decision. So you'd have your small group of people who can make these decisions. And so the benefits of this method lies in the fact that it's based on expert opinions. So you don't have just random people giving their opinions on it. And it's usually pretty quick and easy to complete. And most people have a good time doing this kind of exercise. You end up with like, you know, your 10 items at the top, everything's above the line, you have the below the line, and you know, people generally agree to it, and it works pretty well. It's something nice that you can do. It's a little fun activity, and I wish we really would have done it for us. So making a long story short, for this one, I gave it an 8 out of 10 for a prioritization policy. I really don't think that you can even do defect management without having a prioritization policy. But this is something that you really have to continuously monitor and to make sure that it's effective and it continues to be effective as you continue on. All right. Second item is establishing a Tiger team to resolve issues, which naturally falls into the resolution step of the process. So our problem was there are too many complicated and critical bugs, and they are too urgent for the less experienced developers to be able to resolve in a timely fashion. So our solution was to pull some of our senior developers from their team to create a tiger team to handle these issues. And our hypothesis was obviously that the most critical and complex bugs will get resolved and we can put out the biggest fires. All right, so let's talk about what happened when this was actually implemented. So we lost our team structures and norms that the teams had been establishing over the past several months to years of working together. I mean, this is no small change for a lot of people. Most delivery teams were left without a primary team member, and some did not have appropriate team leadership before. Teams are performing at high levels. They establish their regular cadence and rhythm and rapport with each other. I mean, people are friends. And so when you take your friends away, I mean, I think that really changes people's day-to-day lives. It's really interesting point to note, and also when you do something like this, is that you have to do more knowledge transfer across the project, and that slowed down work for many of our delivery teams. So this is like a little example, of what a tiger team what looks like. And I kind of want to do a little bit of a visual representation, because I think sometimes we just only think about it in terms of like the tiger team and what the tiger team looks like for it. So on the left are existing project teams, and so this is only like 5, but imagine for us, we had 11, and you're changing things up. But look at the impact that this is having on all of the teams. So this was our old and this is our new. Not just one team changes, but all of these teams have different people in their roles that they didn't have before. So I'm not gonna say this is necessarily good and it's not necessarily bad. It just needs to be something that's considered when you're making this type of decision. So like these team dynamics are one of the things that we always really strive for software delivery. And in this case, it was deprioritized for our short-term gains. The newly formed Tiger team of our lead developers and senior developers was able to resolve and close out many of the high priority defects and bugs that we actually had. But what ended up happening in our case is that they ended up receiving way too many items because people are used to giving them the more complicated tasks, and they quickly became overloaded, and their backlog grew so much that they really couldn't handle the amount of work that they had. So other teams had to form and norm and therefore slow down. So I know if you're all familiar with the forming, storming, norming, something else, I can't remember what it is while I'm in here, but all these other teams slowed down on top of that. So I think it's just something really interesting to note. See, I've got some stuff going in the chat. Let me see if I will. Performing, thank you for that. I should have had it in my little notes, but I missed it. Good thing everybody's paying attention to the presentation. So before making changes to teams, I think you always need to kind of consider the following things. So one is you need to set a time boundary for keeping the new team together. So it should not be something that is seen as indefinite. It is something that is a defined time box activity, I like to say. So maybe you can set some performance metrics so you can clearly articulate the vision for the new team. It's something maybe in like measurable terms, so you can bring it up often and make sure that you're staying on track and everybody's a shared like experience. So in our example, this could have been something like the Tiger team is going to complete 100 defects relating to onboarding new users, or they'll stay together for 3 weeks, whichever happens first, right? So, I mean, it's just an example. That's not realistic. 100 defects is a lot. And 3 weeks might not be enough time, but I think if those things come up, you can readjust and make sure that you actually want to keep going with what you're doing. And lastly, I mean, if you're ever going to make this decision, I think it's really important that you get buy-in from as many people as possible before you go and do it. Usually the people that are involved, they may actually, they usually have good ideas, right? I mean, then people will be happy to tell you what they think and why they think it would work. So don't be afraid to ask people before you go and make these changes. All right, I give this a 5 out of 10. So I don't necessarily, I think in the right situation, this could work. This isn't necessarily something that will work for every project team. So your mileage may vary on this one, but just be sure to set appropriate constraints. All right, a fun one with some new terms. So adopting Scrum Bond. And so this will be an interesting one for some people, I think, in here. So the problem that we had was that teams that are fully supporting defects are unable to be effective adhering to the Scrum methodology. So what we did is we adopted a more of a Scrum-bound approach to managing defects. And our hypothesis was that by changing methodologies, the team will be able to focus on quality delivery rather than planning and ceremonies. And so this one doesn't really necessarily fit into like one of these 6 like steps, but I really think this kind of goes into the inspecting and adapting because, you know, as we inspected and adapted our processes, we realized that the overall process really didn't work for us. All right. You could literally talk for days and hours about Scrum and Kanban. I mean, there's trainings that are on them for days long and you get certifications in them. So I can never really give it justice in this short presentation. But on the left is an image of like what a more traditional Scrum methodology would look like. So you have a backlog of your user stories. We plan for sprints, we develop, we iterate, and then we get feedback and then push our code to delivery. A Kanban is what's here on the right, and it kind of looks like, you know, something you would have on like a Post-it board in your office, and you'd be right. So Kanban is really something that you use in lean management. It's more like a just-in-time framework. So it's like you have like a backlog of items, and you have 3 columns. You have to do, doing, and done, or some kind of like, you know, things like that along the top. And you can set some limits and you can get really complicated and really fancy. And if you ever take Kanban training, you know you can do lots of really cool things with it. But this is really just a really simple format. And this is like the gist of it. And I think what you need to know for the rest of this part. So what we wanted to do was combine them together. And so Scrum is very prescriptive in that, you know, it allows you, it kind of gives you, it's a project management framework used to build complex solutions in a fast moving environment. So it's widely recognized and widely used, but I want to just kind of preface that even though that's something that I do, I'm a Scrum Master, so, and a lot of people here are and work in that, it's not always the best methodology for what you're doing. It really depends on what you're building. So for example, if you wanted to build something with no room for interpretation, like you're replicating an existing form, like it's really simple, like 10 items and you know exactly how you want to build it. You really don't need Agile to do that. And as we learned, it's really not necessarily the best for managing defects. And so Kanban is like a process improvement. So and really focus on continual improvement of your process. And so it's a lean management tool, as I mentioned before, that focuses on workflow. It's in simplicity, there's like 3 main states. It's to do, doing, and done. And then you focus on the workflow. And you use work in progress limits, so what's called WIP limits, to help manage your flow and prevent bottlenecks. And you always are working to remove your bottlenecks from your system. All right, so this slide is really illustrated one of our turning points, and I tried to do it the best I could in a slide approach for it. But this really illustrates why we needed to make this change in the first place. So if we were planning sprints out, like in the sprint planning method, which would be the Scrum methodology, teams would generally take items from the prioritized backlog, and you would take like, you know, team A would take the first 5 and team B would take the next, whatever, you know, 5 items, and team C would take the next 5 items. And in the top example, without going into like every single line by line, you know, what we were finding is if you look in the top, you see like defect 1, defect 6, and defect 11 are all delivered on January 1st. But if you look at the prioritized backlog, like it's not in that same order. And we're getting the 5th most important defect out like 2 weeks later than the 11th most important. And we're even getting the 5th one out, you know, 3 days later than the 14th most prioritized item. And that's really like an aha moment that we had. So if you kind of were looking at this more of like a Scrum-bound approach, or maybe a little bit more like Kanban, where we just kind of, every team picks an item from the list. You just go right down the list in order. You're going like 1, 2, 3. So team B finished their defect 2 first, and they picked up number 4. You see A picked up number 5, and it's kind of just jumbled up in here. But the really important thing is that 1, 2, and 3 are all getting delivered on the same date. So our 3 most important items are all going out like on the same time, and they're going out first. Now, it doesn't always go like quite in that same order. Sometimes things go a little bit out of order, but you're pretty much in you know, the right order you need to be in. And so if you think about this in just our small example here, like what a big difference it makes from pulling from a list. Think about this exponentially. When you have like 500 defects like to go from, you don't really want to be putting out your like 100th defect before your like 5th one gets out the door. So this was kind of our big aha moment, as I mentioned, and why we really needed to make that kind of shift. All right, so how do we implement it? And I'll kind of say you can kind of pick and choose what you want depending on your situation. So we still worked within the confines of like our iterations and release points as the regular sprint intervals with reviews and for reviews and retrospectives. And we did this because the rest of not all of our project teams were doing defect management and some were still doing feature work. And we wanted to be consistent with what everybody else was doing and not go off and do our own thing. The ends of sprints become really good times to check in and see where we are, if we need to make adjustments, and people felt really comfortable using like those terms and terminology. You don't want to kind of just necessarily go all one direction or the other so quickly. So work was pulled into the team. So we had a master list of defects, like from our prioritized backlog. And then, as they were ready, we just picked them up into our backlogs, into team backlogs. So we communicated out to our stakeholders in a more like ready, doing, done methodology. We didn't go into like all of like the really, more detailed terms of like people really cared that defects were getting out the door, not that they were in our testing state or in QA or staging. I mean, really when you're reporting out, is it done or is it in progress? The fourth thing is we established WIP limits. And this is a really important one that we had to do because as I mentioned with our Tiger team got really overwhelmed, is that we started saying that no more than 5 items could be active at one time. And we kind of, adjusted this number based on what felt right, or, maybe something was blocked or, for any number of reasons you can make some adjustments. But that really gave us about like 1 item per developer, maybe with like 1 little floater that's going in there. Just kind of helped our team performance. It helped people from feeling overwhelmed. And it kind of could really, I always know there's a lot of people who work with like others who start items and never finish. And they're like, oh, I'll get back to it. And I'll get back to it tomorrow. And then just stays open forever. And we really didn't want that, especially when we had to get the really important stuff out the door. Check on time. Okay. The overall focus of Scrumban is to really improve your cycle time. So we really wanted to get stuff out the door. And anything we did or experimented, our goal was to get defects pushed out faster. That was the #1 goal. And obviously done without, causing more defects. But Scrumban really allowed our team to change course within an iteration without significant detriment to the team. So if you were working in a sprint planning and someone said, I want you to do these 10 new items, you really didn't have a chance to adjust until the end of the sprint. Checking the chat. So what we did is then we could adopt a continuous flow of work. And we eventually got code changes out the door more frequently. We were able to really tell that the cycle time was moving faster. All right, see some chat stuff and I'm gonna try, okay. So Scrumban approach really helped us reveal bottlenecks in our workflow. So we were really able to identify specific areas of the process, which I'll talk about a little bit later in another slide, I think, next slide, but mostly in our analysis phase that were the problem with our cycle time. So in a sprint, we would just worry about all the items that we finished in a sprint. And this way we were looking at each individual item cycle. So this led us to having a definition of ready and setting WIP limits on our developers who like to take on multiple items. It let us simplify our product boards. We basically just use one board to manage our defects rather than resetting at the end of each sprint. We reduced the time we spent in meetings. So we didn't have to do sprint planning. We only had to review a few defects at a time as a group, and that really cut down on some of our bigger meetings. And it allowed stakeholders to get smaller amount of items ready to pull together rather than large quantities at a time. So if you had all of your teams doing 20 bugs on day 1 of a sprint, you'd have to have like 100 items ready to go. In this case, we really only need about like 5 on day 1. And so you could really just kind of minimize that time of feeling like you had to get everything ready. All right, our pain points with this. And so like, maybe I made this seem easy and maybe I didn't. It really isn't as easy as it looks, but here's some of our things. So the reluctance to choosing the next available item. And this was a big one for us in that some of our team members didn't feel comfortable taking the highest priority item. And they would choose something lower on the list that wasn't quite as high a priority because they knew they could accomplish it and they were comfortable. So it's really hard to push people out of their safe space, but we really did push people to try new things. And it's important to kind of grow and get people to do things that aren't out of their comfort zone. You have to make some strategic choices. So our goal is prioritizing the highest priority item. But if you choose the next one on the list, and let's say it's going to take you 10 days to do it, and another developer might only take 1 day, I mean, maybe we really do need to, like, this kind of goes back to our first point, is choosing the next available item. It's a little bit of a dance to get it right. And so you have to answer to a lot of questions about why. So then business stakeholders really started keeping very watchful eyes on the highest priority items, and then reprioritizing new items to the top on a daily, if not hourly basis. And so then they were asking when things were going to be ready. So this was really different from going from a sprint view to like a daily check-in almost when something was going to get done. And so then we also had to deprogram everyone that we weren't doing sprints anymore, even though I mentioned we were still on the schedule like a little bit, but we didn't have the same cadence of events, and we had to put some new processes in place for testing and review and sign off. And there weren't sprint reviews where we demoed things. We just kind of got stuff out the door and got it to production. And last is you have to really assess your team morale. And so regular check-ins with the team about how they're feeling and other stakeholders to make sure that it was meeting their needs. All right, so Scrumban like totally gets a 10 out of 10. Bug sprays, like, the sprint planning method really would not have worked. I mean, if we were only doing maybe the 80-20 split that I mentioned before, we could have totally continued with Scrum methodology and had never had an issue. But when you're fixing items one by one, Scrum just really won't make sense. All right, we're on the second to last one. I think we're still okay with time. I'll try and go through them quick. Creating defect standards. So our support desk teams they had a limited set of knowledge when writing their bug tickets. They were often, for us, not easy to understand, and our developers were spending a lot of time analyzing the tickets rather than fixing the problems themselves. So our solution was to create a bug definition of ready, which is our defect standards for readiness. And the hypothesis here was that this will minimize the time a developer spends researching bugs prior to beginning development, which should overall reduce your cycle time. And this really is in like our resolution step here, is how do we resolve things quicker? So I think a lot of people here in Agilis will really be familiar with what a definition of done is, because I think it's a lot more used. And just really how you know when something is done. It's your criteria. It's a checklist that includes validation and verification and sign off, and maybe it's some administrative tasks that you have to go and like check something is closed or something like that. But a similar but less commonly used concept is that definition of ready, and it's used to determine when a work item is actually ready to start in the first place. And usually you'll see it for user stories using something like the invest method. And I won't go into this in detail, but here's kind of what the invest stands for. What a definition of ready will do is it'll increase your chance of success of completing your work timely. And it should minimize the amount of rework that would be done from misunderstanding of the item. So I kind of want to hint you. So this is our actual prioritized bug functional definition of ready. So this is actually something I took from our thing and put it in here. So some of the original items in here might seem like really, really obvious. So we had something like expected performance, current performance, but like sometimes it might not be obvious to everyone. Like you would be surprised that we had stuff come in that like just had what was going on, but not what they expected the behavior to be. And not everybody knows what the answer is. And when things are moving fast and furious and there's lots of different sources creating bugs, you get a mashup of items. Like it's wild what you'll see. And so some items that we get weren't even bugs. We'd get new requirements and we'd have to figure out how those fit into the process as well. And so some of these things, so then we kind of iterated on our list. We inspected and adapted. And so we added more things. So eventually we added things in here to linking to original requirements, removing extraneous information that you didn't need, adding dependency and blocker details before picking it up, and then some target dates for completion. So these are kind of things that we needed to add as we went, and it really helped us out. We started grouping things together. We started removing duplicates. Like it just started really cutting back our backlog, and our developers were able to start work much more quickly. So then what we ended up doing is setting up some more functional backlog grooming sessions with just the functional team members. And I would kind of split it as functional technical. to think about it that way. Because we had multiple teams picking up the next available item from a backlog, we all had to understand what the ticket was just in case it was the one that we picked up. So, you know, I might interpret something differently than another Scrum Master, and another product owner might interpret something differently. And we really did see that as we did this. So this ended up being super useful for us. We would review every ticket that came in against our definition of ready. And then we made sure we had enough information. This allowed us to share our knowledge across teams. We would confirm whether we could reproduce the item, and especially if they were old, like if they were 6 months old, like sometimes other ticket fixed it. We removed duplicates. We grouped similar items to be done like together at the same time. And then once it was sufficient, we would change the status of the ticket from like new or grooming to ready. And this really symbolized that a developer could actually start work on it. And so one of the things that we did is we kept it strictly functional team. And again, the product owners, Scrum Masters, and our requirements analysts on the project. And so this was really helpful for us because it's very different from a more traditional backlog grooming session where you would be getting story points and maybe coming up with some solutioning to get your acceptance criteria together. But we really were focusing on, did we have a problem? Like, did it exist? Was it understood? And was it ready to work on? So overall, I went like off the charts with this one. I gave this a 12 out of 10. There's probably some people here who could agree on the call with me, but bugs and defects are really tricky and you need to get them done right. So you don't really have any room for error. So once we started doing this, we were seeing stuff, you know, once they were in ready, we're getting out the door much faster than they were previously. And this was a really big achievement to kind of help cut into the overall backlog. All right, the last one. Creating a bug service level of agreement. So our problem that we were having was that our defects had too many acceptance criteria and they were taking way too long to complete. So our solution was to reduce the scope of one individual defect so that it will take only no more than 3 business days to complete. And that's like a rough, you know, thing. But reducing the size of a defect ticket will make the workload more manageable and decrease the time to production. So this kind of falls into the resolution and verification parts with it, because this is where you would resolve the issue and you would verify that, you know, against your acceptance criteria that it is. I'd say this is a very similar approach. You know, if you're not familiar with service level agreements, it's more similar approach to story pointing. You know, but this was really kind of like a gut feel, right? Like, as I mentioned, we didn't have our developers in there. And bugs are really tricky to estimate because you never really know what you're going to uncover and how difficult and how the testing is going to go with it. But, you know, for us, we would start making acceptance criteria and then we'd say, this is too much. So we'd split this up into more manageable tickets. So for those who may not have heard the term of service level agreement, I've seen it a lot in federal contracts, but it's just anything that's like an agreement between you, your service provider, and a client. So if you think about it, it's just your terms of service or terms of contract. So this could relate from anything. So if you had like uptime, your quality standards, maybe some resource availability, cycle time, or just anything. Then for us, it was delivery of bugs. So what's really good about an SLA is that it has some built-in checks and balances for accountability. And so it may not be apparent on the surface, but one of the things that's really important is when you're fixing defects is you don't want to just finish something fast just to get it out the door. This really causes people to cut corners, especially with testing, and you can actually just cause more issues down the line. So by giving some more appropriate time for people to check, back in, analyze impacts of changes, it can really cut down future problems. And let it decrease the overall sense of urgency on most items. So I know when you have really urgent things, people are always checking in and micromanaging on what's going on. And you really don't want that. You're giving people an appropriate amount of time before they talk to you again about it. This has really allowed it for better code review and testing on items, instead of getting them out the door really quickly as well. And then the third thing that's really important is you have a really standard for communicating out when you're going to see a resolution. I just mentioned it previously, but not micromanaging your activities. You're not having customers calling, constantly asking when it is. You're like, okay, this is active. I can expect it out in 3 days. And if it's not, I'll follow up. You just kind of check back in whether you're exceeding your SLAs or not. So as I mentioned, ours with that bugs should only take about 3 business days to fix once it was started work. So obviously there's a lot of items that could be 1 day or less, and that's great. But when things are getting larger, you might want to split them into more manageable chunks of work, exactly like you would do with a user story. When there's too many acceptance criteria and there's more like testable pieces to it, right? So we would split things out to do anything necessary to maintain this agreement within reason. You know, you wouldn't want to, it had to still be deliverable chunks of work that made sense. Some of the things to keep in mind when you're doing this is you may want to consider setting different SLAs for your different levels of priorities for bugs. So maybe your urgent ones are maybe 1 day or less, and maybe your priority 3 are a little bit longer. Who knows? It's just something to consider, that maybe not all bugs are created equal and when you need to get them out. And what's also important is to make sure that your SLA is reasonable and it can actually be maintained. So you really don't want to be setting, changing your SLAs over and over again. Again, that's one of the things that go with like your morale and like how people are feeling towards it. All right, overall, I would give this a 7 out of 10. I think this is a really good technique to use when managing a large amount of defects. This is something that you may want to use to establish before your customer defects start rolling in, so you can better manage your communications. That's definitely something that would be really, I would really recommend. There's really no perfect solution here on this one, but setting expectations is always good to maintaining a calm atmosphere. All right, so let's summarize everything here. So the first, addressing defects before you release will save time, money, and frustration. I think we all kind of know that. But you don't want to just push things off to a later point if you don't have to. But you also have to find the just right solution to not overmanage the process. Again, this goes back to the Goldilocks situation of finding it's just right. The third is to plan for your worst case scenario. You always want to plan for the worst and then hope for the best. And you're usually going to probably be somewhere in between. Have the processes in place. And always like inspect and adapt as you go. Your first instincts aren't always right, and you need to be willing to make those changes to improve. Measuring your changes along the way to make sure that it's working. So it's clear going with the inspecting and adapting, but you need to know what you're doing, why you're doing something. You need to stop if it's not working. Lastly is to communicate your successes and celebrate the big things that are happening so your team stay motivated. All right, I am 7:15. So there is a little survey here. If you want to scan the QR code, you are welcome to do this. I didn't have the QR code that's here, but if you want to scan this and fill out, there's a little survey about this presentation, but I do want to open it up for questions here. So I'll just kind of open it up. And as I said, the presentation will be here on my LinkedIn as well. So I will open it up for questions if there are any.
Hey, Craig, I have a question.
Yes, I don't know who that is, but okay.
This is Kara. Great presentation. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about how it was originally recognized that the team needed to make this switch, and then if there were any conversations or change management tactics that your team employed when having certain conversations with the clients about how this change was going to occur.
Do you have any specific change that you have in mind, or?
So specifically the shift from building enhancements to defect management.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was something that, I think it was planned a long time about the teams needed to, plan the time into their sprint to have that defect level, to be able to support defects. I think we all planned it as a project, I think our release train engineer planned it with our support teams and the business to do that. So we all knew it. I think just there really wasn't in our case a moment, but it just became overwhelming so fast. I don't even remember that much. It just all of a sudden one day it was oh my God, your team has 20 bugs in your backlog, and we have to do something, and we have to make this shift. So we really kind of had to do it by fire rather than a really planned, measured approach. So a lot of these changes we have here are just things we've found along the way that we've kind of, either they've come from our support teams that were managing it, and we've recommended them and tried them ourselves, or we've kind of worked about them with business team members who just were we got to do something fast. I don't know if that really answers the question, but
Yeah,
I wish, like, this is kind of one of those things, like, I really like, this is why we thought it would be important for a change management group, is that I really wish we had really pushed the change management aspect a lot more than we did. I don't think it was quite as seen as critical as it was. And this was a big change.
great, thank you.